Hello and welcome to Exoneree. I'm Exoneree. This is the first case I will be reviewing, so just to start off with a little introduction to the channel. For starters, there's the logo, which I decided to name XUX, which is short for X_X. So if you were literally to type in what does X_X mean, it would tell you that, quote, a face with X eyes conveys emotions, including embarrassment, fright, shock, or little hope. So the XUX logo is conveying a shocked emotion, which I like because the criminal justice system across the world is, as they say in the UK, quite shocking, which translates to extraordinarily bad. I am not British, but I lived in the UK for 6 years, where I did a master's in economics at Royal Holloway, which is in Egham, right outside of London, which is in Surrey. And I worked full-time for 4 years in the city of London before returning to the States. That being said, I still use some British terminology. Nothing that you won't be familiar with, but the Exoneree I will be talking about today was based out of England. So for those that don't know, a solicitor is the same thing as a lawyer. Okay, now an exoneree by definition is someone who has been released from prison because of a wrongful conviction. This channel's purpose is to shed light on some of these exonerees and their cases, because even when these exonerees are released, their stories before, during, and post-release are often overlooked. So with this limited information on these exonerees, I will try to give you as much of their life story as I can. But as this channel gains more momentum, hopefully I'll have a decent-sized team of researchers, get some interviews, that sort of thing. But if you have any more information about any of these exonerees, please feel free to email me at exoneree@gmail.com. That's XZONORY@gmail.com. Please like and subscribe. As an FYI, any proceeds or donations I receive from this channel go directly to my charity, Reform Foundation, where we help people with criminal records get jobs. More on that to come. And without further ado, I will kick off this channel in the United Kingdom with exoneree number 1, Sean Robert Graham Hodgson. Sean has possibly spent the most years in prison out of any exoneree in UK's history at a staggering 27 years. Just to give you a brief summary about his case, Sean Robert Hodgson was convicted of the rape and murder of Teresa De Simone, whose body was found in her car outside a pub where she worked. Hodgson had confessed to a priest that he was the killer and had admitted the offense on several other occasions to detectives, but no assessment was made of his mental state or his obsession with confessing to crimes he had not committed. At his trial, he retracted his admissions, pleaded not guilty, and told the jury that he was a pathological liar. He successfully appealed after DNA evidence found at the scene was proved not to be his. This technology was not available at the time of his original trial. So Sean Hodgson was born sometime around 1951 in Towlaw, County Durham, north of Darlington and south of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. He was also known as Robert Graham Hodgson for reasons unknown. I'm just assuming his middle names are Robert Graham. He was born to parents Jack and Olive, and he apparently grew up in a large family, although the only sibling that I've come across his name is Peter. Both of Sean's parents have since passed, and Sean himself died from emphysema on October 27, 2012, but his brother may very well still be alive today. Sean's brother Peter was there when Sean was released in 2009, where his brother was waiting for him, and in the photo where they are pictured, Peter looks slightly younger than Sean, which would put him, that is Peter, somewhere in his mid-70s today, assuming he is still alive. So he would definitely be someone I would like to speak with regarding his brother Sean and his family and Sean's life while he was incarcerated. So hopefully we can make that happen. And again, by all means, if any listeners out there know of Peter or any of Sean's other siblings and how to get in contact with them, please feel free to email me. Again, that's exoneree@gmail.com, XZONORY@gmail.com. In terms of Sean's background growing up, unfortunately, that's all I know. As far as how Sean got into this predicament of being wrongfully convicted of rape and murder, it can be assessed that it was a combination of petty crimes and being a pathological liar. He was placed in a borstal, which is the equivalent of juvenile detention, at age 11. From there, he went on to commit petty crimes, and one crime of possessing an offensive weapon and another conviction of unlawful sexual intercourse. I have no idea what these mean because we learned later that Sean had no offenses of violence, so I don't know if unlawful sexual intercourse means sex in a public place, or if an offensive weapon is carrying a bat with some sort of slur on it. Who knows? Whatever the case, prior to being wrongfully convicted, the court says Sean did not have a criminal history of violence. Leading up to the crime, Sean entered a rehab clinic in 1978 after he overdosed several times. He had a history of drug use and would be assessed as having, quote, a severe personality disorder and was a, quote, compulsive liar. All right, keep in mind, Teresa was killed on December 5th, 1979. So on May 16, 1980, Sean pleaded guilty to a theft he committed and was given bail awaiting his sentence. And this is where I have to conduct my own assessment. Did Sean actually commit this theft, or did he plead guilty to something he didn't do? While he was out on bail, Sean went on to get arrested again in June 1980 and get sentenced to 3 years in prison. So, like I said, Teresa's murder was committed in December 1979, and right now we're in June 1980, where Sean is starting his 3-year sentence. So right now they still don't know who Teresa's killer is. All right, so during this time between June and December of 1980, Sean would make a number of confessions of petty crimes, some of which could simply be proven were false confessions. And finally, on December 11th, 1980, so practically exactly 1 year after Teresa's death, Sean confessed to a priest that he killed Teresa de Simone. He is quoted as saying, quote, he was particularly troubled because this was around the anniversary of her death, which I think is particularly important to note given his history of lies, because he has a lot in common with the famous actual killer named Henry Lucas, aka the Confession Killer, that I'll discuss later. I'll just throw it out there. Did Sean see a newspaper or see something on the news about Teresa's murder? As you'll see later on, some people think that Henry Lucas was exposed to details of crimes to help him make false confessions. So, like Henry, given that Sean made his confession on December 11th, 1980, so 1 year and 6 days after Teresa's murder, it's very likely that something was in the news about Teresa's killer still being on the loose that came out on or around December 5th, 1980, that was still fresh on Sean's mind that caused him to make a false confession. Sean Hodgson would conduct interviews with the police with more confessions, and the police would go on to say that he knew details that were not known to the public. However, these interviews were not recorded, so it's unknown how much Sean was coerced into these confessions and what he actually knew versus what police told him about their investigation and the crime scene. Sean also went on to say that he killed 2 men around 1978 or 1979 and makes a point to say that one of the men was homosexual. Explicitly noting that one of his so-called victims was homosexual also sticks out to me with regards to Henry Lucas, which I will also discuss later. It turns out that these 2 murders were false confessions as well. During the trial, Hodgson refused to be a witness, saying that he couldn't be trusted because he was, and I quote, a pathological liar. He would not give evidence and would not submit to a cross-examination, and although his lawyer would try to explain to the jury that Hodgson has a history of compulsive lying and had confessed to over 200 crimes, including murders that had not even happened, the prosecutors would make a case that given Hodgson's alcohol abuse, his knowledge of the crime scene, and his confessions, that he was guilty. With a little over 3 hours of deliberation, the jury would find Sean Hodgson guilty of rape and murder, to which the judge would vehemently agree. Little is known about how Sean spent his time in prison. However, he would appeal and maintain his innocence. Ironically, after being convicted, maintaining your innocence reduces your potential to get an appeal. One jarring fact is that in 1998, when forensics were available, the Forensic Science Service, the FSS, had said that no evidence had been retained. It took 10 years until, in 2008, Sean responded to an advertisement in a newspaper for prisoners that advertised for lawyers who specialized in appeals against convictions. Sean was ultimately granted pro bono representation by Julian Young and Ragveer Chan by Mayfair-based solicitors Julian Young and Company. Rag Chan was able to rediscover an archive of evidence that contained all of the swabs taken by the pathologist in December 1979. On January 30th, 2009, it was confirmed that the semen detected in the vaginal and anal swabs could not have originated from Sean Hodgson. On February 26, 2009, Sean's appeal was granted, and in light of the new DNA evidence available, Sean Hodgson's case was quashed. On March 18, 2009, the judgment was made by the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, stating, quote, "The decision leaves some important unanswered question. Perhaps the most important is that we do not know who raped and killed the dead girl. We can but hope for the sake of the appellant and the family of the murdered girl that her killer may yet be identified and brought to justice. But for now, all we can do is to quash the conviction. It is accordingly quashed. The appellant will be discharged. There will be no new trial." End quote. DNA evidence later proved that Teresa's assailant was a man by the name of David Lace. David had a history of aggression and crimes, including burglary and robbery. David had even confessed to Teresa's murder in 1983. David unalived himself in 1988. His confession was dismissed because he had wrongfully described some evidence, including DeSimone's clothes and the car they were in. Sean Hodgson's legal team was never known of the existence of this confession. As for Sean Hodgson, the remainder of his life was as mysterious and brief as my synopsis on his life before prison. In December 2010, so about 18 months after Hodgson was released, Sean was arrested for allegations of SA on a 22-year-old mentally handicapped woman. In March 2011, Sean Hodgson would plead guilty to sexual touching but denied rape. He was sentenced to 3-year community order or community service, minus the 156 days he had already spent in jail. I'm not sure what that sentence entails because there is also a note that the judge said Sean could walk free if he agreed to a psych evaluation imposed by the court, which he rejected. And on October 27, 2012, Sean Hodgson died from emphysema. So was Sean in jail when he died? Was he in a psych ward or some type of prison asylum? Was anyone with him? Again, Sean Hodgson's story outside of prison is very brief and very sad. What are the takeaways? So, for starters, DNA has come a long way. I was born in the 80s, so the idea of a world without DNA evidence or CCTV and extensive databases is a bit foreign to me. Thankfully, cases such as these are being weeded out as time goes on, although there is still a lot of work that needs to be done, not only for wrongful convictions, false confessions, police tampering with investigations, and interrogation techniques as well. You can see cases like the Central Park 5, where police interrogations can be brutal, and although that case was in America, and this case was in the UK, similar techniques were used, and the miscarriages of justice were ultimately the same. For Exonerees, their release is in many ways worse than people who are released from prison to go on parole with job prospects and housing placements. Exonerees are spit back out into society with little to no resources. According to Sean's attorney, Julian Young, Sean Hodgson was released with a one-off payment of £46, which is 58 American dollars at today's price. And the fund that exists that ultimately comes up with a payout for the prisoner shockingly deducts, quote, room and board for the time the exoneree spent in prison. And obviously, this person was wrongfully spent in prison. So it can take years for any funds to be cleared for exonerees. In addition, there are the mental repercussions that exonerees face, such as attempts to unalive themselves, panic attacks, nightmares, and drug use. What can be improved? Well, Sean had a history of mental abuse, and instead of looking at his pattern of pathological lies and curious behavior, the response was imprisonment. Even in a country like the United Kingdom that is overall a progressive country, particularly when it comes to healthcare, they were still unable to diagnose Sean's illness where he could have gotten necessary treatment. In terms of DNA testing and correctly identifying the actual culprit, technology has come a long way, so you're hard-pressed to punish the police in a lot of these older cases. In this case, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, or the IPCC, when trying to determine whether there was evidence of misconduct or negligence by the police during the original murder investigation, given there was a confession by David Lace in 1983 and the denial of forensic evidence in 1998, basically summarized that no further investigation would be undertaken as any of the senior investigating officers were now deceased, and any new investigation, quote, would serve no purpose in identifying areas of discipline or learning opportunities due to the passage of time, end quote. Which sounds a lot like a cop-out because those coercive investigative procedures still go on today, which if addressed could help prevent miscarriages of justice. Maybe someone out there can help me out, but I really don't understand why police are so keen to find people guilty. Even if a crime may seem obvious, the idea of, quote, innocent until proven guilty seems to fly out the window when someone gets arrested. I think it should be mandatory that someone charged with a crime have a lawyer present during police questioning and interrogations unless they explicitly ask to represent themselves. Having a solicitor or a lawyer present would put a stop to a lot of these false confessions and unlawful police interrogation techniques. A lot of people may not know they can have a lawyer, even if given the opportunity, because maybe they're young or mentally challenged, or just from the anxiety of being under duress or a combination. And again, someone who is seriously mentally ill needs to be assessed and treated, not punished. This is paramount in reforming the criminal justice system. What are we trying to achieve? What is our priority? Is it closing cases? The priority should be finding criminals as well as diagnosing mental illnesses that not only cause people to commit crimes, but to make false confessions as well. We put far too much emphasis on punishment. For example, instead of wasting time and tax money on jail and arrest for misdemeanors, we could have alternatives like fines and mandatory community service without imprisonment and court appearances. This would relieve strain on citizens and law enforcement and allow police and doctors to focus on more severe offenses that most likely involve individuals with mental health issues. This would also improve relationships with law enforcement and boost morale for everyone. Which brings me to Henry Lee Lucas, also known as the Confession Killer, who I said I would come back around to. So Henry Lee Lucas was an actual killer. In fact, he was a serial killer. He was arrested for killing 3 people, including his mother, but would falsely confess to up to 600 murders. Although Sean Hodgson was not a killer, his similarities to Henry Lucas are noteworthy, especially when diagnosing and identifying symptoms for someone who may be more likely to make a false confession. Just to summarize, Henry Lucas grew up as the youngest of 9 children. From what we know, Sean also grew up in a large family. We know that Henry grew up poor, and given that Sean grew up in a large family in the countryside in England and committed petty crimes from a young age, I'm making the assumption that he grew up relatively poor as well. For Henry, some key things that stick out about his youth are that his mother was abusive. She was a prostitute and would force him to watch her have sex with her clients. She would also physically abuse him. When he was 8 years old, his mother beat him in the head so badly that he spent 3 days in a coma. She would also force him to cross-dress in public. Lucas would go on to have a sexual relationship with his half-brother and engage in bestiality as well. By the time he was 18, Henry faced his first conviction of 12 counts of burglary. Although Henry would later say he committed his first crime when he was 14 and murdered a young girl while he was trying to do, quote, the things he saw his mother doing with her clients. When Henry was released from prison for the burglaries, he would get engaged to a pen pal he corresponded with when he was locked up. His mother didn't like her, and one Christmas, when his mother came to visit, Henry and his mother would argue and get into a physical fight where she hit him in the head with a broom, and Henry would say that out of self-defense he fought back but blacked out, and during the exchange where he thought he had slapped her, he had actually stabbed her in the neck. Henry's mother would die as a result. Henry was sentenced to 40 years, but given his mental state and unaliving attempts, he was transferred to a hospital where he was subjected to electric shocks, behavior therapy, and large doses of antidepressants. He was released after only 10 years. Not longer after that, he would spend 4 more years in prison for attempting to abduct a minor. Upon his release, Henry would get married to a woman who would divorce him 1 year later for allegedly molesting her daughters. And without getting too deep into Henry Lucas's story, after he got divorced, Henry met a man named Otis Toole, who was a transvestite, that he became romantically involved with, and according to Lucas, went on a multi-state killing spree with for several years. After his alleged spree, Lucas would get arrested for 2 murders. After 4 days in jail, Lucas would confess to hundreds more murders, and because 28 of those murders allegedly could be corroborated, Lucas gained the trust of law enforcement, who would go on to clear hundreds of unsolved homicides through his false confessions. Henry would get preferential treatment for his confessions, such as trips to restaurants and cafes, and being allowed to wander police stations and jails without being handcuffed. Attempts at determining Lucas's involvement in his confessed crimes were complicated when it was discovered he had been given access to information in the files of cases he was confessing to. There were suggestions that the interview tapes showed that Lucas would read the reactions of those interviewing him and alter what he was saying, thereby making his confessions more consistent with facts known to law enforcement. And that is where I will conclude with Henry Lucas's story. But getting back to our Exoneree, Sean Hodgson, are there pertinent things about his upbringing we don't know about that could have contributed to him being a pathological liar and making false confessions? Was he abused as a child? Did he suffer a traumatic head injury like Henry? I mentioned earlier that Sean made a false confession about killing a, quote, homosexual man. Perhaps he was trying to project that he was ashamed of being homosexual. While Henry Lucas was in hospital, a social worker met Lucas and described him as, quote, a very inadequate individual with feelings of insecurity and inferiority, end quote. We know that Henry had homosexual relationships, although Henry was sexually deviant in other ways, which could most likely be attributed to his abuse as a child. Given the period, Henry's homosexuality may still have been something that made him feel insecure and inferior. Henry and Sean were both heavily drugged while incarcerated. Sean was taking dozens of tablets a day at the time of his release. He was quoted as saying, "I was sedated in prison. When they told me I was getting out, I didn't believe them. I thought they were winding me up, that they were telling me lies." Whether it was abuse, poverty, head trauma, neglect from being raised in a large family, homosexuality, drug abuse, or a combination of those things, it is being aware of these types of experiences that may cause someone to make a false confession that will only help solve cases and prevent wrongful convictions. In addition, police do a major disservice by coercing false confessions out of innocent people. The quickest and simplest solution to prevent false confessions, in my opinion, is to not allow police investigations without a lawyer present. And that concludes this episode of Exoneree for Exoneree number 1, Sean Robert Graham Hodgson. If you know anything more about his life, his family, or anything else about his case, please let me know. I can be reached at exoneree@gmail.com. That's XZONORY@gmail.com. Do you know any pathological liars? Is there anything about their life that's similar to Sean's? Please let me know in the comments below. Also, please leave a comment letting me know where you're from. I'm going to be releasing stories about exonerees from cases all around the world, so let me know which country or state you're from, and I'll try to find an exoneree where you live. Please like and subscribe. Anything I make from this channel goes directly to my charity Reform Foundation, where we help people with criminal records get jobs. Until next time, I'm Exoneree. I love you all, and whatever you do, don't get arrested.